Good morning, Neil Sean here again. Lovely to have your company, and as ever, ready to share with you what happened on this day in history. Can't thank you enough for supporting it. I'm glad you're enjoying some of the stories. I know it does take us back, doesn't it? But it's good to go back, you know. Good to look back at things and think, oh, was it better or wasn't it better? Don't know about you, sometimes I watch those old black and white films and you think, how did they cope without the mobile? How did they order things, you know? Everything was a lot simpler in many respects, but of course seemingly a lot harder. That's why these people looked haggard. They worked so hard, didn't they, you know? It didn't matter what job you were doing. And no wonder back then, if you think about it, a housewife's job was a full-time job, no appliances, all of that sort of stuff. And these, of course, are called the good old days. Talking of the good old days, this particular story was highlighted on this day way back in 1911, because this was all surrounding the excitement of the forthcoming launch of HMS Titanic, which was near readiness at this point. Now, what they were planning to do, the White Star Line and Cunard, was team up. And as I often say here on the show, truly nothing is new. What they had was some of the very best chefs, cooks that money could buy in that era to join that particular ship, because particularly in the first class they were paying so much money, they demanded so much style and high fine cuisine that they figured, well, we need the best chefs. One of the desserts, when I was looking at it, you know, was basically jelly with peaches inside and some chartreuse sprinkled round it. I mean, when you think about it, the height of decadence, but really it's jelly and peaches, isn't it? We'd have cream, obviously. Now, what's interesting here is, as I say, the White Star Cunard Company were working together with at least two particular chefs. Not the famous one, of course, who managed to survive through having a little tipple here and there, which was fortunate for him, but two other chefs. And on this day, they were about to sign a book deal to bring out some of the selected recipes that would be featured on the Titanic. And these really will be premiered in all the high-flying newspapers and the early glosses of that day. And as I say, truly nothing is new, is it? They were marketing this so people could then say, well, I think I'll go on there, that looks really nice. The chefs were going to be plastered everywhere and appear at conventions and things like that, so they could drum up interest in people to sign on for what we now know was one of the most ill-fated voyages, launches ever in maritime history. But as ever, what else was happening on this day? Well, in 1804, Alicia Thornton, now I find this absolutely brilliant, because she was the very first female jockey, horse racer, whichever you want to call her, British, who made her debut on this day in 1804 at York Racecourse in North Yorkshire. And you know, we've just seen over here in the brilliant United Kingdom, our ladies football team, the Lionesses, do incredibly well, and they're leading the way for this generation. But let's not forget the girls and boys, of course, who did so much in their generations. And I think it's safe to say that in 1804, Alicia Thornton up at York Races certainly did that. If I mention the words, well, an hearing aid and people crying, oh yes, do you know who I'm talking about? It's the 50s superstar, Johnny Ray, who had so many big hits. Do you remember? He would burst into tears, fall down to his knees and be incredibly dramatic. Or as Frank Sinatra put it, well, somebody just played him a Bing Crosby record and he was in pain. A bit cruel, but no doubt very funny. Johnny Ray, for a period, was an incredibly talented man who had a huge following. Have to say, by the way, when I was very young, I did meet Johnny Ray very briefly. He came up to a club in Yorkshire near me, and it was one of those sort of like you know, the burgeoning sort of late night clubs in the 80s that were around, and he came up there to do a bit of a cabaret, that sort of stuff, very much towards the end of his career. But he was for a while one of the biggest draws, and as you can see from these pictures, basically Johnny Ray sold out the Palladium. People were climbing onto the roof, trying to break into windows. It was, if you like, Beatlemania before Beatlemania. Again, proof nothing is new. Sadly, of course, Johnny Ray's largely forgotten today, apart from a 1950s fan base. But when you think about it, he did have a distinctive sound, a distinctive look, and a lot of people do remember it with a lot of affection. In 1919, you could have been making the very first flight from what we now know as London Heathrow over to Paris, Ooh la la, oh yes, because in 1919, on this day, they did a very first test flight. Can you imagine what the plane must have been like? Apparently they had real chairs in the plane. Now there was no sort of entertainment or anything like that. You could play bridge and there were cards, I think a possible chess set, if you were, strong enough and not too nervous about this. But they did serve wine. But sadly, no ice. They hadn't worked out exactly how to preserve the ice. That happened on this day. And when you think about it now, and you sort of study the fact that people fly around all the time, how brave were these people to go into the unknown, get into a plane, and wonder if they're going to make it over to the other side, which isn't too far, but nonetheless far enough over the English Channel. That's what they did on this day in 1919. Finally, on this day, 1982, it was really exploded over in the United States, all because of this one particular man. Over here, it already had a smash at #1 with Do You Really Want to Hurt Me? And things were truly moving for the world of Culture Club. But more importantly, Boy George. Now, I don't know about you, but I've always liked Boy George. I think he's a character. People remember him. He reminds you a little bit of an Oscar Wilde. Very checkered life when you read it and look into it. But he did make his mark and still continues to make his mark in the world of popular music and culture. But apparently over in America, they couldn't work out if it was a boy or a girl. I never really took into this particular PR stunt really, because it's very obviously a boy with a lot of makeup on, but it was a great push. And as I often say here on the show, what you have to remember is this is pre-social media, so you could whip up a frenzy within the newspapers and magazines and the pop shows, and people kind of bought into it. Of course, they had an incredible run of hits, so many in fact. The biggest probably being Karma Chameleon, do you remember that one? But there were so many also, Miss Me Blind, Miracles, all that sort of stuff. And for a while, not just in America, but around the world, he reigned supreme. He's still live and kicking today, very busy as ever, got a new track out with Kim Wilde, another 80s pop icon, and they're looking at revitalising his musical based on his life, Taboo. Yes. Now, I think that's just too much taboo in one day, don't you? We're going to be back tomorrow with more with what happened on this day, and as ever, I ask, will I see you there? Neil Sean in the very heart of London.